Okay, a little bit of a late start. It doesn't mean I wasn't talking. It just means it wasn't recording worthy. We're in chapter 13, finally. There's only 14 verses in this chapter. Gary. Gary's implying that it shouldn't take as long. But it's a radical change in subject matter, and it's subject matter he's never brought up before. And it's at this point, the text is very choppy in its transitions, where you go from the end of chapter 8 to the beginning of chapter 9. This theological treatise between 1 and 8 ends in chapter 8. And then in 9, you pick up 9 through 11, you pick up what about Israel, history of redemption. What about the people of God? I've showed you that little diagram so many times. I'm not going to bother again, but the horizontal line of what is God doing? Who are the people of God? That's what this stuff is often about, which ends in chapter 11, picking up, therefore, brethren, I urge you by the mercies of God to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice. So there's this transition from the indicative, what is the case, just describing the history of redemption and what's happened recently through Christ, to the imperative. Do this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this, starting in chapter 12. And that will, in a sense, continue at least through chapter 15. It's funny. I have rollers. I have rollers for my bike, so I ride my bike in the living room right now. I did 15 minutes this morning, and I got a little foam cradle so I can put Alexander Scurvy from YouTube on and listen. So this morning I listened to 13 through 16. And first of all, it's amazing how long those chapters can last when you're riding a bike. When you're just reading them, they go, but when you're on your bike, on rollers, it takes a long time. So I'm getting to the end of it and I'm going, I found myself going, oh, Paul, finish already. We got the point, right? As if the book ends, my 15 minutes is going to end quicker, rather than I'm just going to continue on to 1 Corinthians until the 15 minutes is up, right? But it's funny when you're on your bike, you hear every last word. You're waiting for it to go and go and go. But it's very, very choppy. It's what I noticed. I'm going to probably do this every day for a while. Very choppy between the end of chapter 11 and the end of the book. He seems to start over again several times. And so now in 12, he's done that. And 13 is another choppy transition to a very surprising subject, one he's never talked about before. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind makes perfect sense. After all the stuff on the mindset on the flesh and the mindset on the spirit in chapter 8, that makes perfect sense. But now when he gets into being subject to the government, it's a bit of a surprise. And we'll talk about why that is. He's going to spend one chapter on it. Not even. Then he's going to move on to something else, the weak and the strong in the church, and we'll talk about that too. And then he's going to move on from there. That's 14. Then 15, he begins to wind down the book, but he's not finished winding. He's not finished telling them what to do. Well, he's going to tell them what to do to the last. So that's where we are in 13. Questions or comments or things anybody wants to say? Okay, the last half of 12 was a series of short, rapid-fire exhortations. I probably got that from Moon. Not that you can't observe and see the same thing, but one after another. Do this, do this, do this, and little phrases that he doesn't bother expounding on. The first half of 13 is concerned with a single point, and it's in that statement at the top there, although it's a bit of a misnomer. Even when you think about government, you can't think about it the way that we do. We only we think of government as an entity, and that we respond to the government. The government does have a leader who we usually, significant part of the population usually has some kind of contempt for and expresses it. But the leader is just simply the face of that government, of that bureaucratic structure. But we often think in terms of a government or a governing structure. In Roman times, think of a governing authority, a person with a name. So when Paul, when the Jews in Corinth had a problem with Paul. They dragged him before Gallio. Gallio was the proconsul of Achaia, a pretty big, high-ranking person, highest in Achaia. So the governing authority was a name, and that name was Gallio. And he simply decrees. He simply says, I don't want anything to do with this. I wash my hands of you. And he drives the Jews from before the judgment seat, and they go, he lets them beat on the Jews. He lets the pagans beat on the Jews for a little while so they can vent their anger or something like that. Pilate is another example. He is Roman rule in Judea, period. And that's why he can simply decree the crucifixion of Jesus. There's no appeals. There's nothing like that. It's not like Jesus can do like Paul did and appeal to Caesar, because you don't have rights unless you're a Roman. You are at the mercy, other than Romans, you are at the mercy of the governing authority. And they had to handle this situation. All these tensions that arise in this cosmopolitan empire, very, very diverse empire, where they move populations here and there almost on a whim based on their needs, not realizing what that'll do, the displacement will do to the old place and the new place when you bring in new populations with completely different cultural paradigm and value set often. But that all happens. Now this more entropy, more forces working against order. They got to get more heavy-handed. And that's what happened with the Jews and now with the Christians. So you have these three sort of irreconcilable forces at play, religious forces at play: paganism that was endemic to Hellenism in the Roman Empire, inherited from the Greeks. Then traditional Mosaic Judaism, which was always at odds with Hellenistic paganism, because Hellenistic paganism is polytheistic and ritualistic, whereas Mosaic Judaism is strictly monotheistic, period, and devoted to the law of Moses. Now enters a third irreconcilable force, and that is the Christianizing of the eastern provinces, where these people are somehow related to Jews, or the decision needs to be made, are they really just a Jewish sect or not? But they seem to be worshiping and serving a crucified king who they claim to be God or something like that. And so these three forces are now coming into conflict, and these magistrates and governing authorities have to deal with this. And it's going to happen every time the Christians show up in, for example, the marketplace to preach the gospel, or a synagogue to worship if you're a Jew or a God-fearing Gentile. Because I would assume that these God-fearing Roman Gentiles, Roman small r, so to speak, they're not going to leave the synagogue unless they have to. And if the Jews when the Jews got expelled from Rome in 46 AD by Claudius, did those synagogues disappear, or did they get taken over by Gentiles? If there were, I'm assuming there were synagogues. We don't really hear about that in Acts, but if so, now the Jews have to come back, reintegrate as Christians, or even as Jews if they're synagogues that the Gentiles have continued to administer, and either take it back over in the case of the synagogue, or somehow integrate themselves back into the church, where the Gentiles are now, it's exclusively Gentile, and they have the authority, and now they have to fit in. These are the forces that Paul is dealing with. Very swirling, very, very difficult situation. So given these tensions between traditional Mosaic Judaism, the dominant Hellenistic paganism of the day, which had an economic value to it and role to play, and et cetera, and then now the Christianizing of a segment of the Jewish population and enough of a segment of the Gentile population to cause problems, the government is going to be watching that with acute interest, solely for the interest of peace and order and security. And so Paul has something to say about that. And that, I think, is the context. It can seem so strange that he would throw this in right here, but within the context of the Roman Empire in the eastern provinces in, 57 AD, when this would have been written, it makes total sense that he would throw something in like this to a letter written to Christians in Rome, where these forces are just swirling all the time, probably. Remember, at least one third of Rome, it is estimated, consisted of slaves. I don't know how many Romans there were in Rome, but it's bound to have happened where Romans and slaves and Orthodox Jews, Mosaic Jews, turned Christians, and now Roman Gentile Christians, former pagans, they all are going to have to come together and be in a body together and make it work. And there you can see Paul's emphasis on unity. That's what he's getting at. It's that sort of thing. But also, we're not here to begin a rebellion against the government. Acts was very, very concerned all the way through the book to emphasize, Luke was emphasized repeatedly that the Romans had no problems with the Christian church. And then in fact, it was essentially blessed as a sect of Judaism. They took a sectarian view on it. That was Gallio's point in Corinth. Look, Jews, you bring in this supposed breaker of your law. This is an argument between various beliefs about your religious system. I don't want to get involved. That's just another sect of your Judaism. Go deal with it yourself. I don't want to deal with this. And implicitly, he was saying, he was officially ruling, in a sense, giving Rome's opinion about this new sect, this new Jewish sect called Christianity, as they derisively called it, and that it was not a threat to the Roman Empire. Go away. No, we're not worried about this. We have bigger fish to fry than this nonsense. Drove them away. And that's part of the point of that. And that happened over and over again. Not over and over, but several times. Okay. 1 through 7. Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authority, Paul says. Paul says to a church in Rome that he has never visited. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. And you got to define what he means by that. The authorities are primarily going to be interested in order and peace. You keep on this side of the line on order and peace, they're not going to care about you, and you pay your taxes. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. And I have a feeling, as I think about this more and more, that do what is good means do not create disorder. Do not create disorder for the authorities. Pilate basically ruled the same thing with Jesus. Are you a king? I'm not the kind of king that you're thinking of. I am no threat to this governing authority. My kingdom is not of this world. To which Pilate responds by going out and saying, I don't find any cause here at all. From a Roman point of view, I don't find anything to come down on here. They're not going to have it, but something like that was going on. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. And that sword is hanging over the population that wants to create disorder or be a threat to peace. I'm not defending their actions, because the Roman peace was exactly that. Pax Romana, you may have heard that. There's a phrase for this, Pax Romana. Pax Romana existed from the beginning of the empire with Augustus, 31 or 33, I think it's 31 BC, 29 or 30 years, 28, 29 years before Jesus was born. Through the end of the reign of the guy in Gladiator. Who was the emperor in Gladiator? They got killed by his son. Marcus Aurelius. Thank you. That period is often called the Pax Romana. although that seems a little high. I thought that was 180s. Anyway, 200, 250 years. It's a period of sustained peace and order in the Roman Empire. Trade happens. All is well unless you're a slave, or for other reasons, all is well for the people that all is well for. Let's put it that way. And so that was their concern, and they were very heavy-handed about that. And that's why there were Roman roads, and that's why there were Roman colonies spread across the Roman roads from Syria to Tarsus and Rome and so on and so forth. Corinth, Ephesus. And there's Roman legions associated with that, spread across the empire on roads where they can get from here to there very, very quickly. That's what all of that was for. Why did I say all that? I don't know if it has anything. Anyway, I think that's what I think is, I would offer that as a possibility of interpreting his concern here, especially given what he has gone through in his own ministry, where he's been hauled before magistrates and accused of bringing disorder to the empire, basically. Peter and John were accused of the same thing in front of the Sanhedrin. Turn the world upside down is their expression. Disorder. Look what they're doing. Disorder turns into, we tend to, these street protests that go on and there's all kinds of people in them. Look at how fast those turn into riots. And when they turn into riots, very rarely does the intent of the protest continue. The intent of the protest is taken over by the mindset of rioting, which is completely different. And this is the kind of thing that the Romans just simply would not have. And it was one of the reasons that the Pax Romana lasted as long as it did. Not that I'm defending the Roman Empire. In the middle of that was built the Colosseum, where it is estimated that 750,000 people died, or some number like that. It's unbelievable, the brutality. And in fact, that was done to maintain order, to give the people an outlet. They would go watch the execution of criminals. They did it in 3 stages in a day. You had, execution of criminals was one part of the day. Gladiatorial competitions was another part of the day. And then there was something else that happened. And you could go pick the thing you wanted to watch. And in that sense, you're participating in that cultural mindset. And slaves could sit in the Colosseum right alongside Romans. Well, not right alongside, but they were in the Colosseum. All were welcome. You had to know your place and where to sit. But if you went to the Colosseum, you're going to find women, you're going to find slaves, you're going to find Romans, governors, whoever are going to be in the Colosseum. Interesting thing. Bathhouses were the same way. It was communal. And that communal included all the way down to slaves. It's a very interesting way of managing your potentially discontented population. Back to the text. For it is a minister of God for good, but if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. Verse 4, for it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake, whatever he means by that. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due. Here's his overriding principle. Should sound very familiar. Render to all what is due them, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to fear, honor to whom honor is due. It's right out of the mouth of Jesus, essentially. Remembering also that Paul never knew a moment in his life when he wasn't a Roman. He is Roman. He comes from a certain mindset on this stuff. Even though he did what he did, he is a Roman, and that means something. And so in all those contexts, it totally makes sense that this Roman, who went through what he went through in the 3rd journey while he's writing this letter, because remember, that's when he got kicked out of Ephesus, is on the 3rd journey. And he's writing this letter probably right after that happened. Remember, he's writing this letter right after getting kicked out of Ephesus for being accused of fomenting disorder in Ephesus. And that's when the magistrates had to come in the amphitheater and say, wait a minute, we don't want to do this. express your opinion, but we can't have a riot. Romans will. We all know how Romans. Well, Paul is in the midst of that. He's come out of that. He writes this letter. He includes this section in this letter immediately after the Christians were accused by the locals of fomenting disorder and disobeying the governing authorities. So it probably gets around the provinces that Paul is a fomenter of disorder and rebellion. Why wouldn't it? So we see this chapter appear in a letter, unless in case they've heard, perhaps, I don't know, in case they've heard things about him and what he's an advocate of. Resisting rebellion against Roman rule is not one of them. Not only is it not one of them, the ruler, whom you may not like, is an agent of God, enforcing order, enforcing an agent of God for good. And I've just tipped my hat on what I consider the good would be to be from their vantage point. It's this question of peace and stability and order. That's a guess. But it begins to make more sense why he would do this in this context. Does anybody want to comment on that? Because I just spent another 20 minutes talking.
What do you mean when you mention Roman legions?
Let's see. Vic has given me the perfect excuse to talk about the Roman roads. One of the marvels of ancient engineering. Do you see all these connectors right here? Roman roads. That's bad. Let's not do that. Let's do on that. Well, I don't have a really good map of the ancient Near East, of the Eastern Province. I'll get to that in a second. This is Paul's second journey. He would have traveled the well-established roads that Rome built, essentially between Roman colonies, so that the Roman legions, the military forces, could move quickly from one place to another, from one Roman colony to another, and get, for example, to Jerusalem in 70 AD as fast as possible when there's an insurrection, a no-kidding rebellion in Galilee and Judea that will eventually result in 4 legions joining the fight. But they can get from Syria or wherever the Syrian legate, wherever he is, down to Jerusalem very, very fast because of these Roman roads. So a legion was roughly 5,000 Roman military personnel. Then they would be divided up. There's actually more than one, but 100 of them would be under a centurion, and then they would parcel out themselves in groups of hundreds, and they had a commander. I forget how that works, but that's a Roman legion. A Roman legion is 5,000 Roman soldiers plus all of its support infrastructure and so forth. The Romans threw 4 legions at the Jewish problem in 70, and they had a lot of trouble defeating the Jews.
Just like Christ, when they came and Judas betrayed Christ, there's a legion of people that came. So you can imagine when Peter pulled out his little dagger to defend Jesus, That's why, once he was in the military personnel, he just started waving his little dagger around and only got the servant's ear and cut it off. If you imagine Peter trying to take on 5,000 people at one time, military people that had to fight. That's why Jesus said, put your sword away. There's no way that you can defend me from experts.
So John refers to that as a cohort, the group that showed up, the Romans that showed up, a cohort. It could not have been Jews. John would not have used the phrase cohort, and you will see the word Italian supplied in front of the word cohort in that context to make it clear. But if it was a cohort, not that it really matters. If it was a cohort, it would be 600 or so. Not that it even matters. They're not going to take on 600 any more than they're going to take on 5. I mean, there's the Antonio Fortress has 1,000 in it. This is probably 600 from that. So the Antonio Fortress has their rest of the soldiers over there. Syria has a garrison of, I don't know how many legions, at least one. So it doesn't even, I mean, the cohort shows up and it's the full force of the Roman Empire come to bear on the situation. They don't show up with four soldiers. They don't take chances like that. They show up when, like I've said before, when the Tribune at the Antonio Fortress sent Paul off to Samaria in the middle of the night, he didn't send him on a horse with 2 soldiers on another horse next to him. He sent him with 2 centurions, meaning 200 soldiers and 70 horsemen. Overwhelming power. That's how they approach these kinds of situations. Overwhelming power to dissolve anybody of the notion that they can challenge the Roman Empire. That's just how they worked. Anyway, you made a second point that I wanted to comment on. Oh, Peter. As far as Peter's, if I'm wrong on the cohort thing, you let me know. If I'm wrong on the cohort thing, you can let me know if that's what you're looking up. But on the Peter thing, that's an interesting point too, because what did Peter think he was doing? About the angels? He was saying exactly what he's saying. He was saying in different terms exactly what he told Pilate. Peter, what do you think this is about? I'm about to go into the procurator's office privately, and he's going to ask me if I'm a king, and I'm going to tell him I'm no threat to the Roman to your king. I'm the king. My kingdom is not of this world. Why are you acting like my kingdom is of this world? After all this time, you still think that this is going to be some kind of insurrection. And he's got to get that under control right now because of the cohort. So I think he uses his deity at this point, and he puts the hammer down on the whole situation, because the Romans, they're not going to tolerate that stuff. Now what he did, Peter did harm another. He harmed the slave. Think about this: the slave of the high priest. The high priest had a slave who was there. We don't know anything about that slave. So far, it's still a Jewish thing. Marcus, yeah. This is an inner Jewish thing. The Romans are sitting there watching this, but just ready to jump at a moment's notice. If they get the sense, like the Tribune did, when Trophimus was thought to have gone into the temple, and the Jews attacked Paul, and a near riot breaks out in the temple courtyard. Man, those Romans, there's a reason the Antonio Fortress overlooks the courtyard of the temple. Within a minute, there's hundreds of Roman soldiers pouring into the temple courtyard. Not one or two to go find out what happened. They bring everybody. They bring everybody, and they sort out the mess later. And they drag Paul out of there, not because they're trying to save him, but because they're trying to he's the source of the disorder. So let's get him out of here, get him out of sight, calm this situation down, because we don't want the Syrian legate thinking we can't handle this. So he sends more forces down. We're going to handle this internally. That's overwhelming force. That's just how they work. And that's what they were doing when they sent forces in to arrest Jesus. Taking no chances. That's how I think of it. If anybody wants to.
I mean, he basically, I guess when I was thinking Legion was Matthew, Jesus tells Peter to put a sword away, and he said, if I really wanted to call a guy, he said 12,000, he'd send 12.
Doesn't he 12 legions? And if he's using, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's say it was a cohort, which would be, let's just say 600 for the sake of argument. Jesus doesn't pick 12 legions of angels out of nowhere. Everybody knows what a legion is. In Roman context, it's 5,000. If that's what he's referring to. When the angel responds to Jesus, Jesus asks him, how many are you? And he says, we are legions. He means something like lots. But if he means 12 legions and they understand legion conventionally, then Jesus is saying, look, if I wanted to, I could summon so many angels that it would make this cohort look like a little ant colony. It's that kind. I think that's the point there. It's a comparative thing. This cohort, God is not out of control here. The governing authority, Paul's making a point here. The governing authority exists and has authority only by leave of God himself. And when he decides he wants to overrule it, he will do exactly that. If I wanted to, I could make that happen. I'm not going to make that happen because I have a destiny, which you should have figured out by now and you didn't. Maybe something like that. I'm reading all kinds of things into this. I would never give a sermon on this. It's interesting to think about. I might say a few things about it, but within the context, it makes sense.
When Judas came and prayed Christ, they brought a whole lot of people because they could really.
Yes.
So they didn't need to bring a whole military force, to let people go willingly. But, as Fury said, they didn't want to have, with Roman stop, they didn't want to have troubles. They were going to take their responsibility to do what they could.
Presence. It's a statement that is not a bluff. When they show up, they are perfectly willing. They would have a lot of explaining to do, but if necessary, they would be perfectly willing to just wipe them all out if they're a threat to order. Okay, let me wrap this up. We almost finished this 1 through 7. Although I'm not even sure I talked about it, so maybe we have some more to talk about. Yeah, we have a few more things to talk about. Paul, a couple more thoughts here. Paul wrote Romans. He conducted his third missionary journey that took place after 54 AD, which means that Nero was the emperor, the famous Nero, the one that you've heard horrible things about. But the first half of Nero's time in office was very, very peaceful and stable. He wasn't crazy the first half. It was the second half. He was emperor from 54 to 68. It was about 62 or 63, about the time Paul got to Rome. Remember, he was the emperor that Paul appealed to. Think about that. Nero, guy who's considered one of the most brutal emperors they ever had. And that was the emperor that Paul wanted to put his life in the hands of, rather than go back to the Jews. That was Nero. And so all of this right here is happening during the first half of that reign, when things were very stable and peaceful and prosperous and so on and so forth. So one of the themes of Acts is that the gospel was not a threat to the prevailing order. Paul's experience with Roman rule in that book was portrayed as positive. His interactions with, other than the time he got beat. Even then, they made it right in Ephesus, I mean, in Philippi. Other than that, you know. And they were the ones that saved him in 21-22 from the Jews. Paul was accused of antisocial behavior in Philippi on a second journey, Corinth on the second journey, Ephesus on the third journey. So he's very familiar with this, very attuned to the need in order for the benefit of the propagation of the gospel to abide by the rules and not be seen as an insurrectionist movement. They were not an insurrectionist movement and never were. The church is called to be light in the world, to not conform to this world, but it is not called to transform this world. That would be, in my view, a futile enterprise. That awaits the return of Christ. He will transform the world. He will redeem the world. We are light in the world. We are representatives of Christ in the world. But we are not called, like Peter thought in the garden, we're not called to transform this world. And that's the context here, I think. Pick it up
So
next.
it's not our job to make God's kingdom come to earth?
That's certainly not the way that Jesus prayed for it.
Yeah,
Thy kingdom come. He
we
didn't say,
pray it. Yeah,
he didn't, if we were called to instantiate the kingdom or advance the kingdom in that sense, geographically or whatever, however you want to think of it, that's news to Jesus. He never, and Paul, neither one of them ever talked about it. They talked about the kingdom as being a real and present thing, not as a growing thing, a thing that's growing with the growth of the church or something like that. The growth of the church is the byproduct of the present kingdom, the kingdom present among us. And then the church grows as a consequence of that. It doesn't cause that presence.
okay,
How
yeah.
I think of it. I just thought about that ad hoc, so we can talk about that next week and whether I'm right. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and hang up now. It's 10:18. See you guys.
Thank you, Gary.